Jesus doesn't command us to fast. He says, when you fast,
Mhm.
when you pray. So right? It's like he assumes we're going to do that. And then there's this cryptic passage, of course, in the Gospels where some of the disciples go out and they're trying to exorcise demons and they come back and say, it wasn't working. And Jesus says, well, that kind comes out only by prayer and fasting.
Yeah.
The idea is that in some mysterious way, fasting sort of supercharges your prayer. And in some ways, I think as Christians, we very often kind of over spiritualize things. In other words, we try to make things purely immaterial and forget that we are embodied. We have bodies, right? And so what we do with our bodies has something to do with what happens in our spirit and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so what fasting does is it allows all of that. I mean, we are basically channeling our metabolism into a spiritual discipline. I mean, that's a very...
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Made to Shine show. We are in for such a treat today because we have someone who I was just talking to him before. I have his book in front of me. I have annotated so much of this book, and he's just such a light in so many spaces he's held. I mean, he's an editor, he's a producer, he's an author, he's a research director. He's doing so much. Jay Richards, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
Oh my gosh. And like I said, you guys, I'm going to be talking about his book, Eat Fast Feast today. I've annotated this book so much. I think I've given it to like 7 people at this point, just because I'm like, you've got to know this stuff. But Jay, as everyone on this podcast knows, we believe that every single person has a ministry. It's not just preachers. It's not just pastors. It's the way you shine your light in all spaces God has trusted you with. And from afar, I've seen you do that with all that you do. And now from up close, it's going to be even more fun to talk about. But before we dive into the beautiful art of fasting and why you wanted to write a book on that, I've got to start this off with the way we do every single episode, which is, what is your favorite quote and why?
Oh boy. Okay. That one's tough. And so politically, I like Lord Acton's "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," which is a strange and kind of depressing thing. But
wait, say that again. Absolute power.
Absolute power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Which is, Lord Acton was a British statesman in the 19th century, but J.R.R. Tolkien, whom I love and follow and have written on, the author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He sort of shows what that looks like. Sauron's ring is this source of power. And of course, Sauron is this sort of, personification of evil, but even the good characters in Lord of the Rings are tempted by this power. And so that sort of guides my political philosophy, I suppose. But I don't know that's honestly my favorite quote.
But it's up there. It's a good one.
It is. But if I was going to reduce my political views to a single quote, that's probably it.
Love it. All right. Well, what's your top, if you have another top?
Gosh, honestly, a bunch of the ones that I quote in the fasting book. And so I quote Basil the Great, church father, who talks about fasting in giving you both strength and sustenance and victory over death, victory over sickness, and victory over demons. It's like all that stuff runs together, which is in some ways it's kind of the theme of my book. People tend to think of fasting either as, these days, if you're in California, fasting is kind of having its heyday in which it's a popular thing to do. So you think of it as a physical process or something that you sort of add to your fitness routine. But of course, historically, at least, especially for Christians, it's thought of as a spiritual discipline. And the purpose of my book was to say, look, why are we separating body and soul? We are body-soul unities. We're made from the dust of the earth and the breath of God. We're fully human or fully material, fully spiritual. Why wouldn't a spiritual discipline like fasting involve both our body and our soul?
That's so good. And it's so true. It's like fasting's turned into such a buzzword nowadays. And there's like intermittent fasting and all the celebrities are doing it. But to go back to I love it when fads or trends align with scripture. And especially like when science aligns with scripture, like we were always told to do this. And I think what you said is so powerful. It's like, aligning the spirit and the body. And you use that word strength, like ultimate strength. I think, and you mentioned this in some of your content, like when Jesus fasted for 40 days and the enemy came at him, people are like, why, he was in such a place of weakness. It was like, no, he was in an ultimate place of strength because he was tapping into that fasting regime. And I want to go back because as a author, I know when you're interested in a material, especially you have 1,000 things you're doing, like to do something like this out of what you're typically like your requirements are in life, there had to be some bedding curiosity. So when did the bedding curiosity for fasting start? Take us back.
Well, I would say it started way back when I was first started in graduate school. So there was a time, so I'm a Gen Xer. And so I can remember early on, actually, I was at Asbury Seminary. And so this was, say the 1990s. Bill Bright, who had started what was called Campus Crusade for Christ at the time, started just sort of telling evangelicals that they should fast for 40 days. And this just tends to how fasting goes among evangelical Christians, is that there'll be a kind of initial excitement, it'll disappear. But I had a guy that lived next to me in my dorm that did this for 40 days. He fasted, but he drank orange juice. That was the one thing that he did. And I watched him. He managed to do it, but I could say he got weaker and more sluggish, over the time period. And I have kind of tried fasting. I would say I'm the typical person that maybe tried it once or twice. I thought, well, this is terrible, and my blood sugar drops, and I don't see how this is. How am I going to turn my thoughts toward Jesus when I'm hangry? And so that was, I think, kind of the typical experience. And so it really wasn't until about 10 years ago I had this medical condition I describe in the book that causes my esophagus to swell if I eat these foods I'm intolerant to. And I had to go 36 hours without eating. And I was actually eating a really low carb diet at the time, which is relevant. And so right at the end of this, I'm a kind of a fitness buff. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to work out. 36 hours into a fast, so I'm going to just work out. This will be terrible. And instead, I felt weirdly strong. I was energetic. I had this kind of just lucidity. My mind was clear. And so I did what any rational person would do. I Googled mental effects of fasting. And what I discovered was that, well, what happens when your body depletes all of the sugars that it's storing as carbohydrates or it's called glycogen in your muscles and liver, your body starts turning fat into a different kind of fuel called ketones. And a lot of people experience sort of mental clarity when they have that. So I literally stumbled into fasting, and then I got reading and found out that there's a whole kind of subculture. There's scientific research that's mostly recent about the physiological benefits of fasting. As you said, at the time, I would say it was considered still kind of crazy fringe, but then it became, controversial or extreme. Now it's sort of people say, okay, I know there's some people that do this, but I realized Christians have mostly dropped this as a spiritual discipline. Except for Eastern Orthodox Christians who have managed to retain it, throughout the year. And so most of us, either if you're Catholic, you have a symbolic fast on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday, where you basically eat a little less than you normally would, not really fast. And then evangelicals, the pattern is don't fast at all, but then once in a while, there'll be a kind of fasting craze. People do it, but we don't do it in such a way that allows us to make it a permanent part of our lifestyle by adjusting the way in which we eat, which I think is the kind of key to making this a permanent lifestyle change, part of your spiritual discipline rather than a fad.
Yeah, exactly. It's going back to that lifestyle change. And I think you said something very important, which was like, it's kind of taken this, everybody has a different version of fasting, a different definition of fasting. You even said like eating a little bit less on Good Friday, which isn't really fasting. And so it kind of begs the question, like, and you wrote about this in the book, but like based off of Christian principles, like what is fasting and what isn't it? And is it only fasting with food? Because I know there's people nowadays that say I'm doing a social media fast and I'm doing like, what is it and what is it not?
Yeah. And so I honestly think we have a couple of good words in English that work: fasting and abstinence. And so abstinence just means abstaining from something. And so I say, because we have so watered down the idea of fasting, I think it's good to reserve that for food. So fasting means if you're fasting, you're going some amount of time without eating food, by which I mean consuming something with calories, let's say. Abstinence is when you give up something voluntarily. Now you don't abstain from sin. You're not supposed to do that. So abstaining would be something that isn't good or bad, or maybe even is good, but you're going to give it up as a sacrifice, right? So maybe your social media, whatever. And so fasting has to do with not eating food. And that's in our language. We use the word breakfast. That literally means break fast, because you've slept all night, so you haven't been eating. You wake up, the first meal of the day is when you break your fast. And so if you kind of keep that definition, it makes it a little easier to figure out, okay, what are we and are we not talking about?
Yeah. And okay, so I always like play devil's advocate, because this is, for me, I'm a huge workout person as well. I played sports in college. So like moving my body, non-negotiable each day. And I like to work out first thing. And I used to always, it was a routine. I'd get up and have a piece of toast with peanut butter on it before I'd go work out. And I was like, I cannot do my workout without this. Now, however many years later that I've been fasting, I couldn't imagine doing that before workout. Like, but to that point, the two biggest objections I feel like I had were, one, it's not good for you. I need food. And two, I can't do that. That's so hard. Like, why on earth would I do that? How would that bring me closer to Jesus? Like, how would that be good for my body? So talk to me through like those two objections.
Absolutely. So the first one would be that it's not good for me idea. And so we imbibed this idea. Look, I was a strength trainer in college. I taught this. You don't want to go too long without eating. Your blood sugar will drop. You'll go into starvation mode. Your body will get rid of its muscle. It'll hold on to fat. So you want to eat every few hours, right? And that will keep you steady. This was just the kind of orthodoxy, but it had never really been tested. It's also a little bit strange, because if you think about it, for almost all of human history, people weren't able to do that. We were, almost anywhere, unless you lived, say, on a Polynesian island, there'd be times of the year when you had a lot of food to eat. There'd be times of the year when you didn't. There were always traditions where you had a feasting season preceded by a fasting season. And then you just had the reality that you always didn't have wheat thins and frappuccinos available to you. So it just, historically, it seems strange if God had designed us so that we would be optimized for this thing that we just started doing about 40 years ago. But for most of human history, it was bad for us. And when you sort of actually look at it, turns out this isn't true. I mean, if you persistently restrict calories, for instance, a traditional diet, that will slow down your metabolism over time if you do that for too long. Fasting, on the other hand, if you even go up to 5 days without eating, has a different physiological effect. It actually increases norepinephrine, it increases growth hormone, it speeds up your metabolism. It takes you 5 days to get back to where you were before. And so if you have this pattern where you just eat modestly sometimes, you have feasts on, Christmas and Easter, and on many feasts on Friday, and then you have regular fasting where you're not eating, your body is going to adjust to that, and you'll have different cellular structure. You'll have a different metabolism than you would have otherwise, so that now that you're used to doing it, you don't need that peanut butter and toast. If you had tried to fast immediately, though, when you'd been doing that for years, that's a different thing. And so what you want is a sort of on-ramp to this different kind of way of operating.
Yes. And what's so funny is so going into that on-ramp, fasting has taught me so many things, especially just like with the way of life. I've realized, wow, we are filled with inputs everywhere. I think the way we eat is very reflective of the way we consume social media, the way we consume our inbox. It's just like we always need email snacks, like we need message snacks, whatever have you. But all that to say, like, as you mentioned, there is a ramp period, especially this generation we're talking to. We've been conditioned to expect things now, things fast, consumption. So like, what is that ramp period when it comes to fasting? Like, what does that look like? You talk about in the book. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and so as it happens, it takes you about 6 weeks to really adapt to what it's called metabolic flexibility. What that means is that you're just flexible in the way that you metabolize energy. And so you basically think of the body as like a hybrid car, like a Toyota Prius, that can run with the engine using gasoline, but it can also run on its battery, right? And the engine will go off. Imagine that you're a hybrid and you had never used the battery for say 40 years, if you're 40 years old, you've just been using the gas tank, well, that battery is going to not be in the best shape, right? What you want to be is able to do one or the other. And so the on-ramp that takes about 6 weeks just gets you used to that so that your body's able to use glucose and sugar that comes from carbohydrates, or it's able to use stored fat or dietary fat. Because what's happened because of our modern lifestyle, which is basically lots of food every minute that we're awake, lots of really refined carbohydrates that turn to sugar almost immediately. Our body's really good at doing that. It's really good at storing fat. It's really bad at using fat for fuel. And to be able to fast for long periods of time, you need that flexibility. And as it happens, it takes about 6 weeks for most people to do that. And that's actually the length of Lent. If you follow Lent, from Ash Wednesday until at least Holy Week, it's about the length that you actually need, which that's a kind of an interesting coincidence.
That is really interesting. I actually didn't know that. Okay, so I want to talk to like two personas that kind of came into my mind. So first one, the young girl listening to this that's like, all right, Jay, this fasting stuff sounds great, but I'm a little confused because like I'm trying to get looking good by spring break and I'm trying to do, and like I'm restricting my calories. I'm not eating, and like I think a lot of people think this is associated with like calorie restriction. And you mentioned that, and you go through a study in the book where it shows like this is so different than restricting your calories each day. So talk to us through that and how this is incredibly different towards like getting you a quick result that you're going to bounce back from in 2 weeks.
Well, and I should say, you can do that. I mean, everybody that's done a diet like that, where you say slash 500 calories a day, is going to usually lose weight right at the beginning. The problem is that they're going to gain all of the weight back and usually then some. And the reason is that what you're doing is your body adjusts within limits to what you're doing. And so if you eat a lot of food, you don't add all of those calories, but you actually kind of speed up your metabolism. If you reduce the calories that you would otherwise need, your body is going to slow down. What will happen is that you'll probably start feeling kind of cold. You won't have as much energy, and so it adjusts to the amount of food coming in. And so that's why as soon as you go off that diet, you gain the weight. Fasting is not like that. As long as you don't just blow it out of the water and fast for 2 weeks or something. We know that for most people, you can go about 5 days not eating any food at all, because it basically signals something different to your body. Think of it this way. If you're not eating at all, that sort of signals, imagine says a few thousand years ago when we're hunter-gatherers, if you don't have any food, imagine if the second the food supply ran out, right, and you're a hunter-gatherer, your body shut down. Well, everybody would starve to death. What you actually need to do is have energy to go hunt for more food, right? That's actually what happens, is that energy goes up, your metabolism actually speeds up, your mind gets clearer, and it does that for several days. So if you just, rather than that kind of, restriction of calories every day, you just have it punctuated so that some days you're eating normally. Once in a while, you can actually eat more than you normally would, feast. And then other times you're not eating at all. And you have that in a particular pattern. It's just a completely different thing. It's never going to slow your metabolism down like a diet would.
And you think about it, like having 24/7 access to food is a very new concept for the human body. I mean, and especially at the capacity that we have it right now with DoorDash and Uber, we can just boom, like it's very new. And I think it's so funny. Do you know who Dr. Mindy Pelz is by chance?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Love her. So also listen to a bunch of her YouTube videos, and it's so cool because she always says too, like she talks about the hunter-gatherer, like how we weren't designed to always have access to food. And I think what's so powerful is there is that point where you do feel like those ketones, like you feel that energy, but you sometimes it takes a second to get there. And,
it does.
And you mentioned, or in the book, and like the fasting flu, like sometimes there's some symptoms. So talk to me about that, because I think
definitely.
I don't want people to be shocked when it's not easy, but I think it's important to like also talk through why it's worth it long-term for your body. And then of course I want to get into the spiritual aspect.
Yeah, that's right. So it is, if you have never done this, there are going to be some bumps along the way. And so the keto flu is basically what happens if you, let's say you just decide, let's say you don't even fast. You just decide, okay, I'm just going to eat really high fat, really, really low carb, moderate protein for a few days. What happens is your body is going to use up all the stored carbohydrates that it has, or the sugars. It's called glycogen. It's in your muscles and your liver uses that up. And then your liver will say, oh gosh, there's now more of that. I better start converting fat into ketones. But when your body uses up all those carbohydrates, the first thing that happens is that when you're filled with carbohydrates with glycogen, you also retain a lot of water. And so when you get rid of the carbohydrates, you lose a bunch of that water. And with the water, you can also lose a lot of electrolytes, magnesium and sodium, the things that your cells need. And very often that feels like the flu. It's like all of a sudden you're sort of nauseated and you're weak. And so when you first make that transition, I always encourage people to basically kick up the consumption of electrolytes. That could just be, a bouillon cubes. It can be salt that you put in your black coffee, whatever. Do a lot more than you would actually expect. And that makes that a heck of a lot easier in that sort of transition. Once you're over there, it's fine. And the more you do this, the less that problem is going to happen. But honestly, this is what people do. They will either fast or they'll try to eat ketogenically as a transition, feel that keto flu. And it's like, okay, I'm done here. I don't ever want to do that. Just think of it as that hybrid battery that you haven't used for your whole life, kind of kicking on, expect some discomfort. But as long as you increase the electrolytes, for the most part, it might be slightly uncomfortable, but it won't be torture.
Have you ever heard of Element?
Oh, yes. In fact, I drink it myself. I mean, I'm doing a kind of more intense thing right now. And so I put Element's great because it's not cheap, unfortunately, but it's a kind of the perfect balance of the electrolytes you need. And so if people can do that, I say, Element or something like that, put that in your water, be drinking it. And it really does take the edge off initially when you're moving from the sugar kind of glucose, right?
Yeah.
Glucose phase to this other kind of hybrid metabolic pathway with ketones.
Oh, I love Element. I have like a whole thing of flavors up in my kitchen.
That's great.
I did a 3-day fast last week and was just pounding the Element. So needed. I'm curious, what are you doing right now? You mentioned
so basically this is the week, Easter, the Holy Week is next week. And so Catholics call the week before that the Passion Week. And so I'm just basically only eating one meal at night all week, which I almost hate to say that because it sounds sort of crazy, but anybody that's fasted, that's not that big of a deal. And so I just thought I want to do more than I normally would. So that's what I'm doing. And so I just thought, just in case, I'm gonna drink Element in my hydro flask, just in case it happens.
Oh yeah, but I think what's so cool is like, and this is why I wanted to talk to you, is bringing this more normal into the conversation. Like I think right now, so many people associate fasting with like it's dangerous or it's along the lines of an eating disorder or and granted, I mean, for any girls that have struggled with that in the past, of course, like fasting is something you'd have to talk to your doctor with, et cetera. But all that to say, like it's completely different. That's why I wanted you to break down the difference between like calorie restriction and fasting, because it's so interesting. Like for me, fasting has completely reintroduced I really struggled as a young girl with the relationship with food. Like I had an eating disorder in high school. And that and with fasting, I was reintroduced to a relationship with food that now it's this beautiful thing I get to experience. And fasting, it's kind of just like brought me back into parameters to enjoy it and what that feels like. And also the depths of my body like the ketones, et cetera, it's completely different, which is so interesting.
It is. And I mean, I don't honestly think it's surprising that so many of us struggle with eating disorders now at the very time when, if you look historically, of course, fasting is a central part of the Christian tradition. For 1,500 years, all Christians did this. Of course, Muslims do it during Ramadan. Jews do it. Mormons have a particular fasting regimen. Buddhists do it. If everybody is doing something like this, that tells you that it probably has something to do with our biology, with our nature, right? And then if we just all decide we're not going to do that for some reason, and we're going to eat continuously all the time, that's going to disorder us both physically, but probably our relationship with food. And so if fasting's done properly, I would say it orients and orders food properly so that it doesn't control you, but you also don't focus on it all the time because you learn to be somewhat detached from it, at least when you're fasting.
Exactly. It's so funny. I'm reading a book right now. Do you know who John Mark Comer is? He's an excellent author. He wrote a book called Practice the Way, which is basically his whole thesis is we're called to be apprentices under Jesus and learn his teachings. And he's talking about now how boundaries create freedom, and
Absolutely.
structure creates freedom. It's
That's
like
right.
you plan to be spontaneous. And I
Mhm.
thought about that with your work with fasting. It's like it's so true. It's like fasting when your relationship with it grows and you
Mhm.
kind of overcome the keto flu, so to speak.
Yeah,
But when your relationship with it grows, it makes you free from thinking about food all the time and thinking
absolutely.
about like feeling like you always need to have a snack or always need
Yeah.
something. And it's a beautiful kind of dichotomy within yourself. And I think too, I think about that with faith and with your
Mhm.
spirit. And like, you have a line in the book. It's decline in fasting is tracked closely with the decline in holiness and faithfulness to Christian teaching.
Mm.
And I think what's so powerful about that is it makes sense when
Mhm.
you're on the flip side of things. Like now that I've gone through this relationship with fasting, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so in tune with myself. I now understand what it's like to say, like, pray and fast, like, because you
Mhm.
actually can
Yes.
feel your prayers. But for people who haven't experienced fasting, talk through like what you saw in those trends and kind of with your experience with fasting, why that makes sense, like the decline in holiness with the decline in fasting.
Well, I think, and it's just, I'm being somewhat speculative because it's, of course, Jesus doesn't command us to fast. He says, when you fast,
Mhm.
when you pray. So he
Distinct.
right. It's like he assumes we're going to do that. And then there's this cryptic passage, of course, in the Gospels where some of the disciples go out and they're trying to exorcise demons and they come back and say, it wasn't working. And Jesus says, well, that kind comes out only by prayer and fasting.
Yeah.
The idea is that in some mysterious way, fasting sort of supercharges your prayer. And in some ways, I think as Christians, we very often kind of over spiritualize things. In other words, we try to make things purely immaterial and forget that we are embodied.
Mm.
We have bodies, right? And so what we do with our bodies has something to do with what happens in our spirit and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so what fasting does is it allows all of that. I mean, we are basically channeling our metabolism into a spiritual discipline. I mean, that's a very physical thing. We believe in the resurrection of the body, not just the immortality of the soul. And
Yeah.
so I just think that that's how God has set things up.
Mhm.
Christians did it, for very specific theological reasons for a long time, but it sort of made formal what was everyone's experience, which is that
Mhm.
sometimes you don't have a lot to eat. If you're going to have a feast, because you've got Easter coming, for most people, for most of history, the way to have extra food for the feast would be to eat less ahead of time
Mhm.
during the fasting period. And it's not just, we'll think, okay, yeah, but we're not like that. We can afford to eat all we want.
Yeah.
It doesn't occur to us that, well, maybe we're actually designed for that arrangement and we're actually
Mhm.
healthier both physically and spiritually if we're doing this. Yes, it's great that we have blessed abundance in which nobody has to starve to death, but
Mhm.
that's also a problem if it breaks what is really, I think, the design pattern that God has for us.
And what came to mind was like, I think so many of us. I was listening to a sermon the other day. Someone was talking about his friend who was an alcoholic, and when he like got therapy and no longer was like consuming alcohol or even thinking about it all the day, he
Hmm.
was like, my creativity opened up, and all of a sudden my prayer life opened up. It's like I had
Yeah.
all this energy to expend on God, which before it was like consumed with the thoughts of alcohol. And I think about food and
Hmm.
whether we would label it as an addiction or not. I think a lot of us would agree we orient our day around food, like
Yeah.
and I mean reasonably so. Like food is where you commune, so you think like,
Sure.
oh, lunch I'll see my friends, dinner I'll see my
Yeah.
family, and like so that makes sense. But I think in a context like with fasting, what it also does is it frees that up, that energy and that
Hmm.
next expectation towards God,
Yeah.
towards some. It's a reorientation of the heart, of the spirit, and of the posture around that.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. And I think it's important. I mean, the name of the book is Eat Fast Feast for a
yeah.
reason, because feast, that's not a cheat. People say, well, we have a cheat day. It's like, well, who are you cheating
Mm,
exactly? I mean, what does that mean? We're supposed to feast and to
mhm,
celebrate.
mhm,
That's not cheating. That's
mhm,
part of the plan.
mhm.
And it's not something we have to feel guilty about. And that's actually much, much more sustainable. If you have a period where you're not eating at all, a period where you eat sort of modestly, and a period where you feast, I can tell you that's more sustainable. You'll also appreciate the feast more. If you
Yeah.
just eat pretty much as much as you want all the time, and then you overeat once in a while, that's, you can't even really experience it as a feast. It's just a day
Yeah.
that you eat too much.
That is so good. Especially we live in such a consumer mentality or a
Yeah.
consumer world. So like we consume and we consume and we consume. Even like I mentioned earlier with social media content, it's like
Hmm.
the average attention span is now less than that of a goldfish. I mean, I think it's like three. That's
It's
crazy.
terrible. No.
You think about like, yeah, I mean, you have 2 seconds for something to catch your attention and then it's gone. Same
Right.
with food. Like, I mean, I've even been guilty of in the past eating so fast.
Hmm.
I'm like, did I even taste that? I think it
Yeah.
just went down. And then you're constantly thinking about the next thing to eat. And so you're not even enjoying the current thing you're on. We do this with our to-do list in life. We wake up
Sure.
each day and our mind is on the next thing we have to do. We're not even sitting in that current thing we're doing.
Hmm.
And it takes like a patience. It also takes that almost that, like you said, appreciation of the feast. And so I want
Yeah.
to go into that word feast
Hmm.
because a lot of people, when they hear that word feast, their mind goes to Thanksgiving or Christmas or a
Yeah.
pizza from Papa John's or just a bunch of food they can binge at the end of the night. So, what does
Hmm.
feast look like with this Eat Fast Feast framework?
And so feast, I can say that now this is sort of the word feast is language for Catholics. It's not as common for evangelicals, but Catholics and Orthodox Christians use this word, and feast actually land on particular days, but they're always days having to do either with a great saint or something that happens in the Christian calendar, like Christmas, of course, the
Mhm.
birth of Jesus, and then Easter. Those are the two biggies when Christ was raised from the dead. And so a feast is, first of all, a moment, a time on the calendar when we celebrate some great thing that God has done. And so that's what makes a thing a feast. Now, what do? Well, we sing, we worship, we eat things that we might not always eat because it's a celebration. It's just like a wedding, right? A wedding feast in Cana. That's the first miracle in the book of John is the wedding feast at Cana. And so that's the sort of orientation that I want people to have when they think of a feast. It's yes, it involves eating and maybe even eating things that you wouldn't otherwise eat, but it's primarily a celebration of something God has done in history, and we're sort of representing it to ourselves and celebrating that. And if you're doing that, you also want to prepare yourself for the feast. And so inevitably, feasts are preceded either by a fasting day or maybe even a fasting season, which in the case of Christmas and Easter would be, of course, Advent and Lent. Those are preparatory times in which we fast in some way before these great feasts. And then, of course, you have other ones. And then we have ones that are not specifically Christian, but certainly Thanksgiving, that's a
Yeah.
feast. Independence Day, that's a genuine feast. Your birthday, things like that. So that they're not cheat days, but
Yeah.
they're times in which we are going to celebrate a good thing, especially if it's something great that God has done in our lives or in history. And that involves eating and celebrating.
And what is the difference between that and a mini feast that you talk about?
Yeah. I talk about a mini feast because this is the idea of Sunday, that every Sunday, unlike Easter, which happens once a year, Christmas,
Yeah.
it's once a year, of course, Sunday happens once a week. And Sunday, if you look at the kind of ancient pattern, let's say the way Christians did these things for the first 1,000 years, that's sort of, if you want to look at, okay, what happened before fasting kind of got, hit hard times, that first 1,000 years, Christians generally and universally would fast on Wednesdays and Fridays because
Mhm.
Wednesday is the day Jesus was betrayed. Of course, Friday is the day he was crucified. Sunday is the day that Christ rose from the dead. And so even within the week, even if you're fasting during Lent, on Sunday, that's a little mini feast. And so think of
Mhm.
every Sunday as as a sort of feast that you
Mhm.
have, so that if you have a fasting regimen during the week, you still are going to break that with some kind of feast-like activity on Sunday. That's the idea.
Mhm. And I think too, what's so powerful about that is like it's always something to look forward to. I think
Hmm.
sometimes we live life for the big moments, like feast, like Christmas, Thanksgiving, and I
Yeah,
think that's just symbolic of how we live life. Like I said, it's like we
yeah,
live life for the big moments, the fancy moments, and it's like no, it's every single week. There's something to be grateful for. There's something to celebrate. I even in my life, like fasting aside, but I call them macro and micro celebrations. Like
yeah.
I always have to have something on the calendar that's like during my day, whether it's holding my cup of, right now it's collagen hot chocolate, but it's either
I
that.
drink that too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, always good for the hair.
Yeah.
But also just like the macro celebrations, like celebrating my
Yes.
birthday next month. You know, it's always
Hmm.
having those things. And I think that also helps you when you are being disciplined in your sacrifice, whatever that looks like. So
Absolutely.
fasting, whatever have you. And I'm curious, like as someone of faith,
Hmm.
because you know, I mean, most people who listen to this podcast are faith based, but
Hmm.
all that to say, like, there is something even more powerful about fasting as people of faith. It's not
Absolutely.
just some fad out there that can help you, like, be more energetic, hit your ketones,
Hmm.
yes, but like there's something even deeper. And so I'm curious with you, how has fasting, what has it taught you more about your faith and about Jesus, and that you don't think you would have learned had you not started fasting?
I mean, honestly, this reflection that we are bodily creatures, because I would say my prayer
Mhm.
life was almost entirely kind of inside my head before,
Mhm.
as opposed to things, I mean, a lot of us, we'll see sort of traditional praying hands. Most of us don't actually do this, but this does actually orient you in a certain way. If you do particular things
Mhm.
or you kneel when you pray, that's just a recognition that we are bodily. We're not just these kind of disembodied selves, right? Or these psychological selves. And so, in some ways, it's given me more appreciation for that. But it's also created a kind of routine, because you were talking about the micro feast, the macro feast. That's, I think, the way to think about this, because what you want with this pattern of, I'm going to say, the fasting feasting pattern with normal eating in the middle, is that you want it at different time scales. So you want it at the daytime scale. So when you're sleeping, you're not eating, obviously.
Mhm.
You want it at a kind of weekly time scale. So maybe a designated day you fast, and then of course always the Sunday, and then seasonal fasts and feasts. And the easiest way to do that for Christians is to just kind of look at the Christian calendar, essentially. But
Yeah.
notice you're doing that at different time scales. And so then if you do that, like in my case, I generally will fast on Holy Week from maybe Thursday until Easter Sunday, which is usually the kind of longest that I go, which is about 3 days. But that's not the only thing I do. That's the kind of big one, right? But I also sort of limit the amount of time I eat during the day, so that maybe 16 out of the 24 hours of a single day, I'm not actually eating. So that, notice you're getting it at a different time scale, so that it's a pattern at the low level and it's a pattern at the higher levels.
Yeah, and that word pattern, like that's what I think is so important. We were designed, like I think in Genesis, the order of creation, like God
Yeah.
created one thing a day and said, "This is
Hmm.
good," and then it was like there was always a structure, there was a pattern, there was a cadence,
That's right.
and I just think like by nature we are creatures that need a cadence. We were wired
Absolutely.
for a cadence, a rhythm, even like the circadian rhythm, right? Like
Yeah.
and I think we live in such a world we're so reactive to things.
Mm.
We're so reactive to our days and our schedules. And I think like with fasting, what it's even done with me is it's made me kind of held me accountable to creating cadences and rhythms in other areas of my life, that when it's like, no longer is God this thing I fit into my day. Like he's
Hmm.
the grounding for my day. And all of a sudden, all my cadences are rooted in him. And I think that's
Yes.
the coolest thing about it. Um, I'm curious. I always love to think in like cost of inaction is my
Hmm.
favorite go-to word there. But like for the person listening, I mean, they're like, this is cool. This sounds neat.
Hmm.
But what's really the cost here of not doing these things? Like, I think so many people look at it as optional or a great
Hmm.
suggestion. Like, why does Jesus assume that we're gonna fast?
Yeah. I mean, it would be the same thing in some ways. Once you realize it, it's as odd as saying, well, what's the cost if I don't pray or I don't go to worship,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
There's a spiritual cost to that. And I think that's true at the individual level. I think it's true of Christendom and of the church itself. I mean, the reality is that there's a kind of spiritual weakness that, honestly, I'm following sort of some of the things that are happening to Nigerian Christians right now who are being
Mhm.
killed in their churches. And yet there's this amazing explosive growth among Nigerian Christianity. In some ways, in the United States, I mean, the worst thing that happens to me is somebody says something mean on X or on social media, right?
Yeah.
And so, in some ways, what we need to do is build this into our lives, and that's what fasting. It builds a kind of sacrifice into our lives. It's not torture. It's sacrifice and foregoing something that's good temporarily, eating, which is a good, for something higher. The idea is that we're doing one thing rather than another. And so that's why I always tell people, if your fasting is torturous, you're probably not doing it right. Just as if every time you prayed, you got nauseated and passed out, be like, okay, now what are you doing when you pray? That's not how it's supposed to work. Fasting is supposed to be a kind of an internal sacrifice that we make to bring us closer to God and to bring us into a greater state of holiness.
That's so good. It's like denying oneself isn't there's discomfort there, but
Sure.
it's not like you said, it's like it's you shouldn't be feeling like you're about to die necessarily.
Yeah.
But I think that's going back to that rant period of what you said. Also, like it's an honor. It's an honor to like
Yeah.
deny oneself in certain ways. I even think about when you mentioned like the tie between the spirit and the body, and just you think about the ability to choose when you eat and when you don't eat.
Yeah.
That's an honor.
It is.
It's an honor to choose like what you put in your mouth and how you put it in your mouth. And
Yeah.
there is I was at an event last night, and one of the speakers, he had cerebral palsy. And he was saying, I would give anything to be able to get on my knees and pray, because I can't
Wow.
I can't do that. Really hit me. And so when you said like to cross your, like to put your hands like this and pray, like it postures your heart, and you're like, there's a lot of people that can't even do that.
That's right.
And so you think about like fasting and how it's all connected, like being able to have the bodies that we do. And God is the ultimate designer. I mean, he knows how our bodies work. It's not like he's like, you must suffer, you can't have the chocolate chip cookies. It's like, no, he knows how our bodies work. It's for our good. It's for us. And so I just think that's so powerful. And, you know, like if someone is wanting to dive deeper into this, but again, they're 19 years old, they're 20 years old. Like, I think someone in their mind might be like, Jay, am I smart enough to read your book? Which, y'all, if I'm smart enough, you can read it, I promise. But like, what would you recommend they do?
I'm assuming that the person we're talking to is generally healthy and is not, 85 pounds and needs to put weight on, right? So just kind of a normal person. I would just recommend exactly what I do in the book. By the way, the book is written at a 7th grade level. I tested that because I didn't want to, so.
I mean, if I can understand it, you can too, I promise.
No, but I mean, so as you know, because you've read it, I mean, basically there's this kind of on-ramp. And so here's the easiest way to do it, is to spend a week eating ketogenically, which just basically, it might sound crazy, but you eat a very high fat, very, very low carbohydrate, moderate protein diet for a week. And what that does is it gets your body used to burning fat for fuel, but without depriving yourself of food. And so once you're in what this is called the state of ketosis, then you start narrowing the time window in which you eat.
And caveat there, do we, like in that state of that ramp, do you count calories? Is it you can have as much fat as you want?
As much, just do, because the reality is if you switch to this way of eating, I mean, what we're talking about for most people is going to be a lot of eggs cooked in oil or bacon fat and things like this. You're going to feel full. You're not going to feel hungry. You're going to probably really want sweets and stuff like that. But, you can eat spinach cooked in coconut oil and all these kinds of things. You'll feel, the point is not to restrict calories. The point is to get your body in this ketogenic state, because when you get in that, then your blood sugar is going to stabilize. Because what you're otherwise in is your body does not want sugar to stay in your bloodstream. And so if you eat something that's carbohydrate rich or straight sugar, the first thing your body does is your pancreas produces insulin. Basically, that's a signal that tells your cells, open up and get rid of this sugar for me and store this sugar. That's how we're sort of normally working. And so because of that, your blood sugar is going up and down and telling you, oh, gotta eat about every 4 hours. Once you're in ketosis, you're not going to experience that, because your body's just, it's running on the battery. It's not running on the gasoline. And once you're in that state, it's much easier then to narrow the time window in which you eat. But again, like on the second week, you're not trying to limit calories. You're just limiting the amount of time during the day in which you eat whatever you would normally eat. And so really the first step is to get to the 16-8, which is, in other words, eat everything within an 8-hour time window. And then you go 16 hours, of which some is going to be when you're sleeping, without eating any calories. That's so-called intermittent fasting. And so, and then on the third week, you limit that, you narrow it to 4 hours for at least a few of the days. Then on the next week, you do narrowing. It's basically one big meal a day for at least 3 of the days. And then you keep this kind of diet pattern. The goal is not to eat ketogenically your whole life. The goal is to just get you adapted to this kind of thing.
And you talk about the 2 different metabolisms.
Yes, exactly. And so the goal long term is that you would be able to switch back and forth between these things and you'd be used to it. And that's where I am. And so it's, people think, oh man, you waited until 7 o'clock to eat. But it's after years of doing this, it's sort of like, oh man, you can run a marathon. Yeah, but I didn't start doing that. If you're going to run a marathon, you have to start by being able to run a mile. That fasting is like that. It's a skill and a discipline and a practice. It's not, the sacrificial element of it, actually, I've got to do longer fasts, or it doesn't really feel like that big of a deal. But that's what I want people to do. I want them to be able to build this into their life going forward. It's a spiritual discipline. They're also going to be a lot healthier. I mean, we are beset by so-called diseases of civilization, which are obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes. These are all kind of metabolic diseases that are the result of our particular way of eating. And this switch can actually help reverse that in many cases.
Yeah. And I also think too, food for people is such a avenue that they go to numb out fear or stress or insecurity. And so for me, something that I've noticed is just like with fasting, that's not an option.
That's
so
right.
I have to confront that thing. And that's where the prayer and fasting comes in, because I'm like forced to pray. I'm like, well, God, I can't drown myself with some Cocoa Puffs right now. So like we're talking. And it's just, it's such a cool framework, of course, like brilliantly designed by our Heavenly Father. And I think too, like you mentioned, exactly. Take your time. I mean, if I asked you to go run a marathon today and you've never run before, it might be impossible for you to do that today.
That's right.
But that doesn't mean it's impossible for you to do for like ever in the future. It just means you have to build your way up to that. And like I really struggled with the 16-8 when I first started 3 years ago. And then I just did a 3-day fast last week. And it was like, I mean, I was uncomfortable at times, but took some element. It was great. Like I felt great. And so all that to say, I think that's such a good point. And last question, because I know I'm going to get questions about it. Jay, can I have anything? Can I have coffee during my fast? Can I eat? Like what is that?
It's totally, I mean, look, there's no strict rules. I define fasting as not consuming calories, but I don't count, say, black coffee or green tea. Okay, there's some slight calories to that, but it's not metabolically significant. And so now sometimes people will want to abstain and say, okay, well, I want to sacrifice that. I want to give up caffeine. I would say don't try that altogether, because the reality is if you're used to consuming caffeine and you don't do that, plus you're trying to fast, you're dealing with too many things. And so if you decide you want to abstain from that, again, do a drawdown over a several day period or something like that. But I don't, at least the way I understand this, I don't count tea and coffee, non-caloric drinks and things like that. I don't think that that's breaking a fast. Now, if you put 300 calories of melted butter and ghee and cream, then at some point, that's a different story. But generally, if you're used to consuming caffeine, continue doing that, but just forego maybe all the sugar and the cream you normally put in it.
That's it. It's so funny you say it like that, because what comes to mind is, like keep the main thing the main thing.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sayings is KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Like let's stop overcomplicating stuff.
That's right.
But even like I think about what my pastor once said, like, why did Jesus come back with only 2 commandments? Like love God with all your heart, love your neighbor yourself, because you can't find any loopholes when there's just 2 rules. Like, and I think like just with like you mentioned with fasting, it's like the more you add in all these nuances, the more loopholes there are. It's like just keep the main thing, main thing. And that's what contributes to that lifestyle that you were speaking with.
That's exactly right. And I think, and you do just, after you do this for a while, I'll say, so for instance, in my own case, I generally fast on Wednesdays and Fridays, but I don't want to be the fussy person. And so if there's a really important feast that's supposed to happen on Wednesday and I'm going to be with people, I anticipate it and I just shift to a different day. And so, but at the beginning, you really do want to kind of keep things kind of clear and as simple as you can when you're making the transition.
That's so Craig Rochelle, I don't know if you know, he's
Yeah.
a great, yeah, he talks about like the power of pre-decision, like you
Yes.
pre-decide. So like
That's
every
right.
week I know what my fasting regime looks like. And I know, okay, so my birthday dinner is coming up on a Wednesday.
Hmm.
And so, okay, I'm not gonna be able to fast on that Wednesday.
Yeah.
That's okay. I'll pivot to Tuesday.
That's
And
fine.
like you just pre-decide what you're gonna do and how that's gonna
Absolutely.
look. And then yeah, and then you plan to be flexible. It's like you
Yes.
plan to plan, but you also surrender to when life happens. And I think
That's
that's
right.
how you make it a lifestyle.
Exactly.
But Jay, thank you. I can personally just say thank you for taking the time to write something like this. It's so powerful. And even as we were talking about before, like this is your fun thing that you do, right? Like this
Yeah.
isn't even, you do so many things. This isn't even your main thing, which is insane. But you're just an amazing author. You make some very complicated things understandable to what could be a preschooler. And that I think is the best sign of a teacher. So just thank you for your work here. Where can people find you, find the book?
Okay, so book anywhere, at Amazon.com. It's called Eat Fast Feast. If you want to know my thoughts in real time, actually, I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Dr. J. Richards.
Amazing. Well, Jay, thanks so much. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
So good to be with you.